Good morning, everyone in Science and Values. This lecture is going to be about one of the readings that you have for this week. There are several readings on a traditional, what's considered more of a philosophical question, unless itself a scientific question, and that is, what is science? What is the nature of science? Is there something essential about what this human activity um, that we call science has? Does it have an essential nature? That is a traditional philosophical question going all the way back to Plato. Um, Socrates would ask in Plato's dialogues, what is X? And when you say what is X, the question is does it have an essential nature? Does it have something that if we discovered what that thing is, we would know that it is that thing and not something else, a defining characteristic? And so this week's readings deal with that question. What is science? And this is a big question in the larger field known as philosophy of science, of which science and values is a subfield. And so uh, next week's readings get more um, appropriately into uh, science value interaction. And you already got that a little bit in the O'Hear reading from last week. But this specifically, these questions about what is science are, I'm having you do these readings because, at least to my mind, it's helpful to think about if we're going to talk about science value interaction, it might be helpful to think about, well, let's define our terms first. What is science? Does it have an essential nature? Because if we're going to evaluate the interaction of science and values, and we're going to say, is it appropriate or inappropriate for science and values to interact in these ways, it might be helpful to know what science is so that we can more appropriately or thoroughly evaluate the interaction between the two terms. So these readings are more of a kind of a precursor to the more detailed discussion of science and values that really gets started next week. So we're going to be dealing with three major approaches to the question, what is science? And they're really spread out historically. Um, we're going all the way back to the Enlightenment, to the time of the modern period in science, the rise of modern science. Folks like Galileo and Newton and Kepler. We're going all the way back to there, and there was a contemporary of them. His name was Francis Bacon. He was a philosopher. He was also a scientist. He was interested in providing um, science with a method, or describing what the method of science ought to be, and indeed the scientific method that you're taught all the way through grade school and even up into college is we get it from Francis Bacon. So then we jump way ahead to the 20th century, and we're going to be reading someone by the name of Karl Popper, who was a philosopher of science, who provides a critique of Francis Bacon. And then we read one other um, philosopher of science, very, very influential in the 20th century. He wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and his name is Thomas Kuhn, who in some ways is providing a critique of both Popper and uh, Bacon. But this lecture is going to be specifically focused on Francis Bacon. So, in the introductory lecture, I mentioned the value free ideal, which is a position about whether or not scientists should or should not incorporate values into their research, into the ways that they communicate with the public, into the daily work of being a scientist. And the value free ideal tries to suggest that science is fundamentally in conflict with values, that science is a descriptive enterprise simply concerned with collecting data, interpreting that data, and reporting about any conclusions you find with the data. But there's no evaluative task involved in what science does. And indeed, uh, science can be harmed. The practice of science can be harmed if scientists are forced to include values into their considerations. And so, you know, it sounded as though the readings from last week, Anthony O'Hear very much agreed with that kind of thinking. And the origins of this, even though Bacon himself never calls it this, the origins of this kind of thinking about what science is, and how it ought to be, the origins of this kind of thinking start with Francis Bacon. In some ways, we can argue that beginning with the modern period, Francis Bacon ushers in what we might call the modern view of science um, as value free. Uh, and in some ways, it's helpful to think about who was Bacon responding to in describing science in this way. And Bacon was responding to Aristotle. Aristotle, uh, one of the classic ancient philosophers, along with Socrates and Plato. Aristotle had a method of not just doing science, but of just classifying the universe in a way that's called teleological, which is to say that we describe a thing. When we want to explain what something is, we have to ask about its purpose or its essence, that a thing has a purpose or an essence. So the example that's given in the reading, and this is most famously attributed to Aristotle, is that if we wanted to ask what the essence of fire is, what the purpose of fire is, we would say that fire's purpose is to rise. That is where fire belongs. And in some ways, it's not. In some ways, it's a caricature of Aristotle to describe that that's what he was up to. But there is a general criticism about trying to ascribe purposes to things in nature, to say that things have a purpose. Um, we In some ways, the critique there is that we are the ones who are describing or ascribing purposes to things in nature. Things on their own don't have a purpose. It is human beings who um, falsely attribute purposes to things. And so we might be anthropomorphizing nature when we do that. And that's really the starting point for Bacon's critique of um, Aristotle's view of science, is that we need to get over trying to think about nature in relation to us, that somehow nature exists for us or is there for us to be studied. No, Bacon's view is that nature is just there as a machine, so to speak, operating according to we observe something in nature and then we seek out its explanation. So we observe events and we want to seek out the causes of those events. And so science proceeds on the basis of explanation and prediction, similar to what you're being asked about in the quiz and similar to what was in last week's readings. But we ourselves have nothing to do with what's happening in nature. We are simply observing what nature is revealing to us. We discover what's already there. And so this is really the modern view of nature, that we have nature over here and man over here, and man just studies nature as a kind of casual observer, and nature reveals her secrets to us. And that, again, we ourselves have nothing to do, except insofar as um, we determine the truths. They would be true even if we weren't there. And so that is the premise of Bacon's view of science, is that it needs to overcome this kind of human-centered view that we get from somebody like Aristotle, and then even into the medieval or Christian view of nature, that somehow nature is imbued with purpose, not from human beings, but imbued with purpose from God. Um, and so we have these three views of nature. We have the teleological view of nature according to Aristotle, that suggests that things in nature have essences or purposes, and we have to discover what those are. We then have a kind of, the Christian view of nature, that in order to figure out what nature is, we have to ask what God's plan or what God's purpose is for things in nature. And then we get to this modern view that really divorces God or human beings from nature and just suggests that nature is just there as an object to be studied. And we simply discover it, we describe it, we explain it, but we ourselves have nothing to do with the truths of nature. And that's the modern view of nature. And this is kind of, you can see how this kind of sounds like something like a value-free ideal, that it takes human beings out of the picture as much as possible, because we distort the truths of nature. So that's what's going on with Bacon. And so in the reading, you're going to see that Bacon describes that certain idols that we need to avoid if we are going to figure out the truths of nature. And I'm not going to go through each of the idols individually, but the general theme with all of them is that somehow it's us that are getting in the way. It's something that human beings are creating with these idols that get in the way of truly understanding science. And the reason he calls them idols, of course, is that if you think even in the context of religion, I don't remember if it's one of the commandments, but that you should not worship false idols. That besides the true God, that there are other idols, like maybe like money, or sex, or sins, but maybe money in particular is something we worship, and give our allegiance to, when in fact that's just an idol that's distracting us and tempting us from the true one God. And similarly, Bacon is describing all of these idols that are distracting us from figuring out the truths of science, that we ourselves are getting in the way, and that what we need to do is try to bracket all of these idols, or all of these distractions that get in the way, the idols of the marketplace, and the idols of the cave, and the idols of the tribe, and the idols of the theater, that in their own unique way, even though they have a specific meaning, and generally speaking, they all are getting in the way of figuring out the truth about the universe. And this is a big theme during this time period, is that in order for science to proceed, we have to get out of the way. We're just, the modern period is emerging from, that science is now answering questions that religion couldn't. And so we need to kind of set science on a secure path so that it can achieve certainty and truths and help continue to progress, civilization forward. And so that's really what's going on with Bacon. That the model for science, as Bacon describes it, is presuppositionless observation. And each of the idols in its own way is a presupposition. A presupposition is kind of an unspoken premise that we are not really aware of. Oftentimes, when we make arguments, we are presupposing something. And the goal of philosophy sometimes is to make us aware of our presuppositions, things that we maybe are assuming to be true, and we don't think we need to argue for them, but in fact, we have to argue for them and make them explicit. All Bacon is doing with these idols is he's making these idols like he's making us aware of our presuppositions, our tendencies to do certain things, to only see the universe in terms of ourselves. And so by exposing these idols, by exposing these presuppositions, Bacon is allowing science to proceed how it ought to proceed without us getting in the way. So when we observe the universe, we ought to do so without presupposition, without idols. So the ideal for the scientist, the image of the scientist for Bacon, is a presuppositionless observer who simply stands back, observes nature, describes nature, interprets the data that's given to him from nature, and makes predictions and explanations only on the basis of the data available. So, the Baconian, if you will, scientist is a very safe, cautious, risk-free practitioner of science. Now, that really does cover what's going on with Bacon. And in the second half of the reading, and if you'll notice in the notes on page, if you go down to page 3 of the notes, in particular pages 21 to 29, O'Hear, the author of this continuing reading that we started last week, O'Hear wants to immediately kind of ask whether this view of science is without problems. Does it have any issues? And indeed, this view of science is known as induction. Induction is the leap from a bunch of particular cases to reach a general conclusion. And so is Baconian induction as a method of what science is and what science ought to be, does it have any problems? And of course, what O'Hear wants to immediately point out is that, in fact, it just has some inherent limitations. And indeed, what he announces early on is that one of the particular idols that Bacon had warned us against, in particular the idol of the cave, was suggesting that we try to avoid bringing our own personal biases into science. O'Hear suggests, look, as a scientist, you're going to want to study one thing as opposed to something else. Or maybe it's not even at the level of studying. Let's say that somebody else gives you something to study. You're going to notice some aspects of a situation more than others. And that in its own way, maybe that's not a value consideration, but noticing something rather than something else means your attention is focused over here as opposed to over here. And maybe another scientist's attention is focused over here as opposed to over here. And that doesn't seem to be problematic insofar as different scientists, different individuals notice different things. We have different predispositions. And so if Bacon's philosophy of science is recommending that we even try to bracket all the way down to the level of predispositions, if it's suggesting that, then it doesn't seem to be something we should recommend as a practice for doing science. Because on the one hand, it's valuable to have different people noticing different things, and on the other hand, you may just have a passion to study something as opposed to something else, and that isn't necessarily something we should avoid. So those aren't problematic. We start to see then how values are kind of creeping into science, and it doesn't seem at that level, at the level of predispositions to notice one thing rather than another, that's really problematic. And so O'Hear, seems to want to quickly point out that is not if the argument is this: if Bacon's method of science is recommending bracketing all the way to that extreme level of predispositions and noticing something rather than others, then insofar as it recommends that, it's not desirable, that it cannot achieve that bracketing the idol of the cave specifically is not something that we should desire to do. However, that specifically is something that O'Hear wants to criticize. But there's also a further problem with induction as a method of doing science. That induction, and it's inherent to the very nature of induction as a method of doing science. Induction as Bacon has described it, relies upon a bunch of particular observations, general particular observations about A. We observe instance A, and we observe instance B, and we observe instance C, and we find a phenomenon present. And so then we generalize to a hypothesis about all the particulars. And that is how induction proceeds. And there's a really well-known criticism from a philosopher named David Hume in the 18th century, or 17th century is when he was writing, is that he called it the problem of induction. And the problem of induction is simply the claim that induction relies upon assuming that the future will resemble the past, that things in the future will continue to remain steady and constant, and as they have been in the past. And so the way we observe things in the past and the way that we observe things now will continue to remain that way in the future. Induction must assume that the future will resemble the past. But we cannot just assert that the future will resemble the past. It has to be a premise that's argued for. We have to, when somebody is asked to justify how they know the future will resemble the past, their only response seemingly will be, well, that's how it's always been, and it will continue to be that way. So if somebody asks you, tell me how you know that the future will resemble the past, your response is, well, the future has always resembled the past. But yet you're being asked to justify that premise, not simply repeat it. And so there's a kind of circularity to that argument. You're kind of asserting the thing that you're being asked to prove. Now, this may not be a huge problem this may not be a huge problem. You may think, of course, this is what science is doing. Science is never in the business of proving anything. Science is only in the business of making predictions. But insofar as we're talking about something that is essential to what science is, it seems as though induction, to some extent, fails on its own grounds. Induction cannot be the only thing that science is doing if it relies upon this kind of faulty premise. Remember I talked about presuppositions a second ago. Well, induction presupposes that the future will resemble the past. And so this is known as the problem of induction. Hume points it out. He's mentioned in the reading, but induction, to some extent, then is kind of stuck with this problem. And this is kind of where I'm going to leave off here, and then I'm going to pick up with Popper. But if you notice at the bottom of the notes, right. So anyways, there's a lot of detail going down on especially in the bottom of page 4 and 5 of the notes. It describes the problem of induction in detail if you're more interested in it, but what I've just described is the basic problem. And so it's at this point with induction as not being able to adequately address this problem that Karl Popper is going to come along and provide a new answer to the question, what is science? His method is going to be known as falsification.